here, and welcome to English 350 Style. As you probably know, this course is a hybrid course, which means that we'll meet only on Thursday afternoons, and rather than meeting as well on Tuesdays, we'll cover essentially Tuesday's material online. Rather than open with prefatory comments on style, and there's a lot I want to get to on that matter, I thought might be better to simply jump into some of the more practical and logistical matters of finding your way around the course material on Canvas. And then we'll turn to the first video lecture material on the first set of stylistic devices that you should really know. And so to start, I suggest you all log into Canvas. Hopefully you have a dashboard that looks something like this. And hopefully you have a course titled Style. It's either English 350 or Writing 350, WRT 350. And those courses are equivalent, so don't worry which one you're enrolled in. They're both the same course. And so within Style, that course module, I suggest first off going to the syllabus and downloading the syllabus, and please do read the syllabus. It's a contract between you and the university that I essentially facilitate, okay? And so you really need to understand, what you're beholden to. And if you have questions or concerns about that material, bring it to my attention early on. I'm not going to work through the entire syllabus, don't worry. As I said, please do read it. You're responsible for knowing, understanding this syllabus. I'll just mention a few things briefly. And number one is, as you know, the course is about stylistic devices. And the goal is really to allow you to gain more conscious control over your writing, or if you're going to be an English teacher or professor someday, to gain more conscious control over the way you discuss and analyze writing. Again, at this stylistic level, what we find oftentimes is students understand or can kind of identify, oh, this is a case of beautiful writing, or this is a case of effective writing, and they can oftentimes use a variety of higher order terms to discuss it. But where they lack sometimes is in a technical understanding of the stylistic factors that have gone into the creation of that beautiful or effective prose. And so that's what we're covering in this class, is a lot of different, essentially, sentence level, phrase level patterns that don't always get discussed in university curricula. And the English department has agreed that it needs to be discussed. So that's in a nutshell what the course is about. And of course, you can find me in class. Of course, we meet every Thursday, 3:40 to 5, up in the third floor of Dunleavy 330. My office hours are indicated on the syllabus here. Basically, midweek, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 1 to 3 in the afternoon. If you haven't already done so, I strongly suggest buying the 4 books that are required. You'll need them. You'll need the toy piece right off the bat, and the Strunk and White, Ceccarelli, and Tufte will come a bit later. They should be available in the bookstore, and of course you can always get them online at Amazon or elsewhere. The course is pretty simple in terms of assignments. You'll have several quizzes, 7 of them, that'll all be handled online through Canvas. It's the honor system here, and so while in those quizzes, you're free to use any of the course materials, your notes, or even the internet to take those quizzes. I do ask that you don't consult other people when taking those quizzes. Of course, I have no way to enforce that, hence the honor system. You'll also give a presentation later in the semester, and I'll discuss that down the road. It's quite a ways off. In addition to that, you have 3 writing assignments, okay? No midterm, no final exam. And so the 3 writing assignments are described in the syllabus, of course. The first is that you will write a stylistic analysis of a text of your choice. I do ask that that text be prose in nature and not poetry. I'm just not competent to evaluate poetry. And so we'll be focusing on prose style in this class. The second assignment will be to write an essay of your own, short, 350 to 600 words, on a belief of yours and a particular situation in which that belief was tested, challenged, or formed. And in the writing of that short essay, the challenge is to really follow this style advice offered by one of the four texts we're reading in class, Strunk and White's text. So that's assignment 2. And then for the third assignment, you'll really design your own final project for the class. And I leave it in this way because I want you to be able to make this course meaningful for yourself. And so I hope you'll put a lot of thought into what you want to do for that final assignment that allows you to intersect your own interests in language with the obvious curriculum objectives or curricular objectives of the course. And we can talk at length throughout the semester. So that's really it for the assignments. The quizzes, a presentation, 3 written assignments, and that will comprise your grade. Of course, I won't read through all of this material. Be sure to read it. There's a late penalty. Don't plagiarize. And at the end of the syllabus, you'll see the course schedule. And that's important to note that in the due column, the black items are due before class that day. They're not assigned that day. So for instance, by February 6th, when you come to class, you'll have already taken quiz 2 on Canvas. You'll have already read Toy's Introduction to Classical Rhetoric, or to Rhetoric, I should say, and you'll have already watched video lecture number 3. Then we'll come to class, and class time will largely be devoted to, number 1, any questions you have about the material. I think that's the most important use of the class time. Number 2, some exercises that we'll do in class to kind of further consolidate your understanding of the material that you've been reading in preparation for class. Okay, and then on some days we'll have peer review where you'll be required, for instance on February 13th, you'll be required to bring 2 draft copies of your assignments, assignment 1, and we'll break into groups. You'll review those, offer feedback for each other, constructive criticism in preparation for turning in the assignment the next day. Of course, what's indicated in red is what you'll need to bring to class, and there's not much of that. You'll bring drafts of your assignments on 3 different days, and you'll also, when you're giving those your own student presentations in the mid to late March range, you'll have to bring a bunch of materials. So again, please be sure to have a good look at this syllabus. Bring any questions you have about it to class on Thursday. With that out of the way, what I'd like to turn to is the first lecture material. Okay, and that will be the first set of stylistic devices that you should really know. Now, I would suggest you just memorize these. It's going to be in your better interest. Though in this course, there really isn't an assessment mechanism that requires you to memorize them. Your quizzes are online, and you're able to consult your notes as well. But if you really are trying to set yourself up well, either as a writer, a teacher of writing, or in other way, kind of just growing your awareness of language, I really do suggest just kind of incorporating these concepts into your kind of daily thinking when you're reading and writing. So we'll just dive right into this presentation. Today I'll cover the first 8 stylistic devices for the course, and then in the next lecture I'll cover the second 8. And those 16 stylistic devices sort of provide the foundation for discussions of style in class. Okay. Some of these I'm sure you'll be well familiar with, and this might be, you'll be seeing it for the second or third time, I suppose. I don't want to say really remedial material because it's not, but hopefully this is a familiar territory for some of you, and it doesn't hurt to kind of pass over it once again. And the first stylistic device is simply parallelism. And this is useful across the full domain of prose writing, especially academic writing and expository nonfiction writing. And by parallelism, what we mean is simply that in your writing, you're maintaining grammatical similarity across coordinate elements. Now, what do we mean here? What are coordinate elements? Coordinate elements are two or more elements that have similar value or position in a phrase or in a sentence, okay? And so in this first case of kids who study music learn confidence, discipline, and creativity, the coordinate elements are confidence, discipline, and creativity because they're the three things in a series that the sentence is conveying, okay? So the first step in understanding parallelism is understanding that you need to identify coordinate elements. And by that, in other words, coordinate is being used here in contrast to, say, subordinate or superordinate elements, right? Coordinate simply means of the same value. So step one here, if you're wondering, oh, is this sentence written in parallel structure? Step one is to say, well, what needs to be grammatically similar are the coordinate elements, and the coordinate elements are confidence, discipline, and creativity. And yeah, confidence is used as a noun in this sentence. Discipline is used as a noun in this sentence. And creativity is used as a noun in this sentence. And so, yeah, this sentence is parallel because it meets the definition of a parallel structure. That, in other words, the grammatical similarity is met here along those elements. Okay? And so here would be a case that of faulty parallelism, right? You still have the same three, or almost the same three coordinate elements. You have confidence and discipline, but now you have this are creative on the end. And so what happens here is if you think of how the reader parses a sentence when he or she is reading it, you can kind of see why this doesn't work well, right? Why it's considered faulty. Because as the reader is reading, the reader starts, kids who study music learn confidence. The reader sees a comma, and then they see another word, discipline. Now, the reader tacitly is thinking of how to interpret this sentence, right? And they are seeing confidence and discipline, and then they see comma and. And so right away they are expecting another term that is parallel to confidence and discipline. And do they get it? No, they get are. They get are creative. And so that requires much more cognitive work to interpret this sentence, okay? And so it's just not considered generally good writing. It's faulty parallelism. You might be able to semantically convey what you're trying to convey. I mean, we know what this writer is trying to convey, but it's not conveyed in the most effective manner, right? So you have noun, noun, and now you have this weird verb-adjective construct. So you'd call that faulty parallelism. Now, I will say there are plenty of times when you may wish to break parallelism for some good reason. Okay, so when in doubt, write with correct parallelism. That's an easy rule to follow. But if you're reading work and you see, oh, this person's writing and the sentence isn't parallel, but this is a really strong writer, there are cases of creative use of faulty parallelism, but you need to know that you're doing it to create some strategic effect. Okay, they're rare in parallelism, but they do exist. Okay. A few other cases. So, in truth, it was a failed marriage, a wrecked home, a destroyed world. Now, stop and ask yourself for a minute, what are the coordinate elements? I'm hoping, as you read that sentence, you notice that there are kind of three things again here, and they are pairs of words this time. So the coordinate elements are failed marriage, that's one. Wrecked home, that's another. Destroyed world, that's a third. And so the question is, are they grammatically similar? Well, you've got an adjective noun phrase for the first one. Second one, adjective noun phrase again. So you've now created an expectation in the reader's mind that if there is going to be a third element in this series, it will likely follow adjective noun manifestation, right? That's what the brain is expecting. It's slotted for that interpretation. And it's met. right? You have another adjective noun. So yeah, parallel structure in this case. Now let's look at this other case. So what I've done here is inverted that final phrase. Instead of destroyed world, we have a world destroyed. Okay, that's the only difference. So again, we'll go through our test, right? Coordinate elements are indicated in blue, and again, you have adjective, noun, noun, adjective. Okay, so since that's been inverted, it doesn't meet the definition of parallelism anymore because it's not in the same grammatical pattern as the first two, right? So yeah, this is an example of faulty parallelism, no doubt. But this is an example, likely, where the writer is attempting to create faulty parallelism for a reason. What do you think the effect of this sentence is? I mean, how does that ring for you as you read it? In truth, it was a failed marriage, a wrecked home, a world destroyed. I hope you can hear the emphasis that comes on the word destroyed in this case, right? In the first case, that is parallel, they're all of kind of equal emphatic value, right? Failed marriage, wrecked home, destroyed world. You might see a bit of emphasis because the scope is getting larger each time, right? It goes from marriage to home to world, so it's growing in that way. So you might see that as a kind of emphasis. But I hope you can see in the second case that that inversion of parallelism, which creates faulty parallelism, does have a kind of punch at the end of the sentence, right? And so this is a case of trade-offs, right? You're gaining emphasis, but offering up, sacrificing parallel structure. So typically with parallelism, what you're going for is balance, as in the first sentence with the check mark, and clarity. And in that second sentence, what you're gaining is emphasis. Okay, let's look at another example. This is more likely in kind of academic writing. So ask yourself, maybe you want to pause the presentation at this point and ask yourself, what are the coordinate elements, and are they grammatically similar? Okay, this is the kind of question I'll have, on the quiz or in the classroom exercises. Okay, so hopefully you paused and came up with a decision for yourself on what you think the answer is here. The coordinate elements in this case, so again, right, you always need at least two things, two elements or more to have a question of coordinate or subordinate or superordinate. Okay, and so the two things that the reader will be comparing for parallelism in this case are told and added, the two verbs in the sentence. Okay, so you have, on August 22nd, the reclusive Mullah Omar told blah, 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 but added blah, blah, blah. Okay, and we don't, from a point of view of parallelism, we don't care what the rest of the sentence says. So the question is, are told and added grammatically similar? Yeah, they're both past tense verbs, and so you've got parallel structure here. Okay, I don't have the counter to that, I guess, but it would be somehow a common case in student writing would be, instead of saying but added, they might have a different tense of a verb, like but adding or something, right? That Mullah Omar told a working level State Department official that the strikes were counterproductive, but adding that he would be open, blah, blah, blah. And in that case, you'd have told and adding, and that would not be parallel. Okay, they'd be faulty. You oftentimes see parallelism emphasized in technical writing, scientific writing as well, when you're talking about instructions. And this would be a case in especially high-stakes writing, where you're looking at really writing concise, easily interpretable prose. And so this is a case from actually the Apollo 11 flight plan. And you can see here, hopefully, that the question is, what's parallel in this case, right? Now, in this case, you have to look at multiple sentences, in a sense, or multiple phrases to get coordinate elements, because each individual line, none of the individual lines has two or more elements to compare. But you can compare through the instructions in this way, right? So all of these instructions begin with that imperative verb, and that's a common technique in technical writing to offer in the interest of clarity. Okay. I will mention at this point a more abstract comment, and that is that if you're interested, I think you will notice that many of the stylistic devices that we discuss in class today, or this semester, I mean, they apply not only to written language, but to any form of compositional art, right? Here is an example: Samuel Zellner's National Monument. This photo is discussed in terms of parallelism on photography boards on the internet. Ten Tang's untitled piece here, as well, is discussed in terms of parallelism. Okay, and so all sorts of designers and artists beyond the world of writing discuss parallelism in an analogous fashion, right? And so it's any case, really, where you have coordinate elements that are manifesting in similar patterns. And so, right, the coordinate elements, of course, in the Zellner piece are simply the columns, you know, that are the upright columns, and in, of course, the Tam piece, it's the those reinforced. It looks like, you know, these bars, these joists, I suppose. And so that was another example of parallelism. So if you're interested, you can kind of look at the world, anything that's been constructed, right? I mean, anything within the realm of compositional arts, music, architecture, sculpture, painting, molecular biology, that you'll see the stylistic devices we're discussing in those realms. Okay, and I encourage you to do so. That would be a way for you, if you're interested, to broaden the scope of this course, but also connect writing with the other arts that it has so much in common with. Next stylistic device is antithesis. So we needed to start with parallelism because antithesis requires parallel structure. And antithesis is simply placing side by side, or juxtaposing, contrasting ideas within a parallel structure. Now, in this course, I want you to really use this definition. You can search the web and find definitions of antithesis that don't have the additional parameter of requiring a parallel structure. And I think that's misguided in a variety of ways that fall beyond the scope of this course. So I'm just going to offer you this definition. It's a very common canonical definition, and ask you to use it and not be sort of, you know, hoodwinked into thinking of, or believing in other definitions of antithesis that arise. So again, there's your definition, but it's oftentimes easier to understand it with examples. So here you have to err is human, to forgive divine, and you have two different ideas here that are contrasting. In other words, you have a double antithesis, which is very common in writing of all sorts. First, you have the contrast between err and forgive, and secondly, you have the contrast between human and divine. And so just for that, and you have the fact that these phrases are offered in parallel structure, right? That they have, if you think of these contrasting ideas as the coordinate elements, they are in similar, in this case, identical grammatical form. Err and forgive are grammatically identical in concept, and human and divine, right, are both used in the same grammatical form. So you got parallel structure, contrasting ideas within it. Here you have a case from the New Testament in the Christian tradition, right? Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? So, what are the contrasting ideas here within this parallel sentence? Well, there again are, I think, at least two, actually three. First, you have the contrast between look and pay no attention. Second, you have the contrast between speck and plank. And then third, you have the contrast between your brother's eye and your own eye. So you can kind of see here, and this is what we want you to start to do in the beginning of this course. We want you to be able to talk about a sentence like this in a new way. And what you can say, right, if you start understanding sentences in terms of their stylistic appeal, is you can say, yeah, the hypocrisy expressed in this sentence is conveyed largely through a triple antithesis. Right? That's the kind of language that folks use with writers, professors, literary critics, teachers are using, to discuss this material. You can discuss it on a multitude of levels, but if we're going to talk about style, then we should be at least talking about it in terms of such things as antithesis and parallelism and register and the other terms we're going to get to. Neil Armstrong, famous case, right? One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. So hopefully you kind of just have an ear for this at some point, right? So you can just see right away there's a small step and a giant leap, and they're in contrast, and you've got a contrast between man and mankind. Of course, this was in '69, so mankind was the term. Today it would be more likely phrased as humankind to get away from that kind of sexist language. But again, you've got one of the most famous phrases of that decade being conveying the grandeur of the moment through a double antithesis. Why do you use antithesis? Much like parallelism, antithesis has some typical effects, and they are clarity and emphasis. Okay, so you have a way to convey emphasis other than, the kind of less sophisticated, less effective ways of, using an exclamation point or underlining and things like that. I'd really suggest that if you find yourself in writing using exclamation points and underlining to create an emphasis, I'd suggest you step back and try to use a stylistic device to convey that emphasis. It's typically thought of as more effective. Obviously, that depends on the genre to some degree. I should also mention at this point, this category on my PowerPoints here of typical effects, that has a lot of room for exceptions. Okay, so please don't trust that category too much. It's true, antithesis typically conveys clarity, and it typically is used for emphasis. You might think of that as a rule, with 30% of the instances being exceptions to that rule. Okay, so this just gets you in the ballpark. I don't want you to, the definition, please hold true to that. The examples, yes, they're correct. The typical effects, take that with a grain of salt. You can use them, No one has the license on how language is used these days. We can turn to graphic arts too and see a good case of antithesis in this case, right? So you've got she's broken, he's okay, and that those two sentences are conveyed through different colors, which I think is pretty clever. And so you've got, again, a double antithesis, maybe here referring to a certain relationship, and that's conveyed through that stylistic device. Again, antithesis isn't relegated to prose English language or prose natural language of any sort. We have a case here, a recent French artist, Helena House, who has an exhibit currently kind of sweeping the internet and on display in Paris, Hell Hath No Fury. And what she does here, I think, cleverly is uses, again, a double antithesis to convey the kind of bifurcating challenges placed on her, in particular as a woman growing up in France. But of course, she's offering it to the world as perhaps a statement on how other women might try to be sensing competing challenges on who they need to be. And so what you have here, which I find fascinating, is, right, she's got this weapon, this club, with these spikes, hammered through them or affixed to the front. And then in contrast to that, these kind of beautiful blue calico floral print, And so she's using these, right? She's using this to create a kind of contradiction or antithesis on what it means to be on her experience of being a woman in France. That's how she's framed it. She's really localized it to her own experience, right? And then she's, in the article, if you're interested, Google her and you'll find it. She's talking about this need, this demand upon her to be beautiful and kind of passive, and at the same time feeling an inner capacity for power and perhaps even violence, and that, she's reconciling that. What I found really fascinating in this piece was that club looks pretty sturdy, right? But she actually made it out of a kind of ceramic that's very brittle. And again, to sort of discuss or to express this bifurcation of her own experience as a woman. So here we can start to talk about, again, technique in art through these same terms that we're using to discuss writing. And it's not a big surprise because when these various plastic arts, performance arts, gained professionalism, whether that in the last 400 years for many of them, they turned to the rhetorical tradition that had existed since at least Aristotle. 380. Aristotle was born in 384 BC, so you think of him as a 4th century BC Athenian, philosopher, rhetorician, the first person to systematize rhetorical theory in the Western world. Okay, and so by the time you have such things as Renaissance painting or modern forms of sculpture emerging as a sufficiently large, professional society, 1600, 2000 years later after Aristotle, they turned to the rhetorical tradition for a kind of vocabulary to use to express, to discuss their art. And so that same vocabulary is what is used to, underwrites much discussion of written composition today. So again, there are just a lot of connections across the design arts, writing being one of them, that are worth seeing. You don't want to silo yourself too much as a writer and miss the application of your awareness as a writer to things beyond discursivity, right? Another case from Helena Haas, just same principles in mind, so I won't spend too much time on it. Okay, next stylistic device is chiasmus. Now, I hope you're taking notes on all of this. And if you are, you might want to kind of think of chiasmus and the next stylistic device, antimetaboly, as kind of pair. They're a pair. They go together, sister terms, okay? And they both have to do with inversion. So chiasmus is a conceptual inversion. And what I mean by that is that what you're inverting is the grammatical concept of these coordinate elements, okay? Not the actual words themselves necessarily, but the grammatical form. That's what's getting inverted. And I'll give you examples because that's probably not particularly clear. We'll go back to our sentence that we discussed in antithesis or in parallelism. In truth, it was a failed marriage, a wrecked home, a world destroyed. Once again, let's look at the coordinate elements like we did in parallelism. You have a failed marriage, this wrecked home, and now you see a term for what I discussed in parallelism as inverting world and destroyed. That term is chiasmus. It's a stylistic device. So I've inverted world and destroyed, and therefore the grammatical case, the grammatical status is inverted as well, right? So you go adjective, noun, noun, adjective, okay? So I've inverted the grammatical order here, and therefore it's chiastic in nature, and I've done so likely for emphasis, which is oftentimes what chiasmus is used for. One of my favorites, oftentimes attributed to Aristotle, though I don't believe there's any extant evidence that he actually said or wrote this. But it could be the case, right? And it speaks to his sensibilities. So Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth. Again, I hope you can hear the emphasis there, a kind of poetic emphasis on truth, right? It would sound very different if I said, Plato is dear to me, but the truth is dearer to me. That would be parallel and non-chiastic, right? But it doesn't really have a ring to it. It's two equal. All of the elements are of equal value in that case. And Aristotle isn't wanting that. He wants to put an emphasis somewhere. Oftentimes we put the emphasis at the end of the sentence or at the beginning of the sentence. When we want to put the emphasis at the end of the sentence, sometimes we have to invert words to get the word we want at the end of the sentence. And that's what he's doing here, right? So you've got Plato is dear to me, and dearer still is truth. So you've got noun, verb, and adjective, and inversion. Adjective, verb, noun. And that's how he's getting that emphasis. Another one. I have journeyed in the lands of the Spirit, drunk from the fountains of wisdom, rested beneath the trees of eternity, and to the land of my birth I have returned. Right? So this is not, so we'll go through the kind of analysis. This is the same thing you would do in a way for the study of asking yourself whether it's parallel or not, right? And the same kind of protocol is used to decide whether it's chiastic. So you've got 4 verbs. So you've got, first off, journeyed, then you've got a prepositional phrase. Again, drunk, which is a verb, prepositional phrase. Rested, which is a verb, prepositional phrase. And now what's the reader expecting? The reader is expecting another verb and another prepositional phrase if it's going to be parallel. And what do they get? Oh, they get the inversion. They get the prepositional phrase first and then the verb last. So that inversion makes it chiastic, the use of chiasmus, okay? And again, for emphasis. Now, this is a tricky one. This is chiastic as well. Dark was the night. But you have to ask yourself, compared to what? Right? There aren't 2 things in here to compare to see if one is the inverted form of the other, right? There is just one. Dark was the night. The answer in this case is what it's being compared to is our expectation as, or for someone for whom English is their first language, the expectation that person would have in terms of the grammatical form of a sentence, okay? And what they would expect, in other words, there's an implied comparison here. What we expect as native English speakers is a sentence in which there is the noun first, and then a verb, and then usually something else, an adjective in this case, which works, or an object, or a prepositional phrase afterwards, right? But it's usually like noun, subject, verb, object, right? Subject, verb, object. The SVO style is the kind of status quo that we are used to hearing. So when that's inverted, as in the case of dark was the night, we know something's up, right? If I said to you, right, like, long was the day and dark was the night when I met my friend in Cincinnati, I mean, you would know I'm speaking poetically, right? You would know that there's something going on here beyond just conveying factual information in a literal form without figures of speech, because you know implicitly the standard structure of sentences in English, okay? And so in this case, it's chiastic because the coordinate elements are the 2 different sentence structures, one implied, right, and one that's actually offered to you as the text. So that's an example of chiasmus. We might call it implied chiasmus. Okay, and I'm just showing you literally the inversion there in terms of grammatical pattern. And this is what I mean by conceptual inversion, because we don't actually need the exact same words in chiasmus. We need to be inverted. What we need are the grammatical forms to be inverted. Okay. One more case, or maybe not one more, another case. The brute facts themselves mean nothing. Only statements have meaning, and of the truth of those statements, we must be persuaded. Again, emphasis attempted on the final word, and so the last phrase is inverted, this one in blue. How we know this? Because if it were not inverted, if it were the way the implied status quo phrasing of this would have been, the brute facts themselves mean nothing, only statements have meaning, and we must be persuaded of the truth of those statements. Fine. It doesn't have the ring to it that the first one does, right? But there again, you have that SVO, subject, verb, object, or noun in this case, noun, verb, prepositional phrase working. And since the example, the non-implied, the first example, doesn't follow that pattern, we know that it's been inverted, right? Of the truth of those statements, we must be persuaded. So that would be, we'll do it this way. There we go. So that would be chiastic in nature. If you have any questions on these, be sure to bring them up in class on Thursday, or email me in the meantime. Let's Let's work through this one. This comes from the New York Times from a 2019 article that I really enjoyed. I come from a polite Midwestern family. We never argue. We acknowledge each other's viewpoint and honor each other's truth. Now here starts the inversion, because what you're expecting next is another subject-verb structure, right? Because you have we never argue, we acknowledge. Now you're looking for another we or I, but you don't get it as a reader. You get a prepositional phrase, but to the pantheon of complaints children lodge against their parents, affairs, abandonment, forgotten birthdays. Now you finally get to the subject, or in this case, the noun subject. I'm adding this, unbridled optimism. My parents believe in the power of positive thinking. There's so much going on in here stylistically, but we're going to cover simply chiasmus at this point, right? So that's the inversion. If it were not inverted, it would be read as, but I'm adding to the pantheon of complaints children lodge against their parents, unbridled optimism. What's fascinating here, I think, or at least useful for us as writers, is she even delays, so she's trying to emphasize that unbridled optimism, which comes at the end. And I like that she even delays it further by using a colon, which gives us a pause and a kind of suspense, and then drops the unbridled optimism at the end. It's a really sophisticated, effective creation of engaging voice here. Okay, enough with chiasmus. As I mentioned before, its sort of sister term, which is another version of inversion, is antimetaboly. The difference is, antimetaboly is a case where the exact or almost exact words themselves are inverted, not their grammatical type, okay? And so you simply have the words themselves. These are easier to identify. Standard one, what people usually talk about is, JFK's call. Ask not what you can do for your country. Sorry, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country, right? And so it's the exact same words. They're just reversed. They're inverted. And so you have country, you, and then you, country. So that inversion means it's antimetaboly. And now, some people argue antimetaboly is a subset of chiasmus. Some people argue antimetaboly is its own construct. In this class, I don't care, right? Clearly, if you see a case, you need to be able to identify it as antimetaboly, okay? Don't, for instance, if you answered this quiz that this was an example of chiasmus, you would get it wrong, okay? So you need to be able to distinguish the two. All I'm saying is there's a debate on the relationship between antimetaboly and chiasmus. Okay, in this class, that debate is beyond our scope as practicing writers and aspiring teachers, professors, professional writers, whatever we're up to, designers, artists. So antimetaboly is when the exact words, or almost the exact words themselves, rather than their grammatical category, are inverted. Let's see if this one is. I don't remember. Those who are talking don't know, and those who know aren't talking. Yeah, so it's the exact words, talking, know, talking, that are inverted. And so it's antimetaboly and not chiasmus. Does everybody see? I hope y'all see that. East and West do not mistrust each other because we are armed. We are armed because we mistrust each other. Yeah, again, antimetaboly, because you have mistrust and then armed and then mistrust. So yes to antimetaboly, no to chiasmus. This seems to be the simple logic that clothes the naked impulse emanating from me. But it's the impulse and not the logic that motivates my silence. Yeah, that looks like a case of antimetaboly because you're using the exact words again. Logic, impulse, and then the next phrase, those are inverted, and impulse, logic. It's hard to talk about the effect of antimetaboly beyond just saying it draws attention to the sentence. And so as a writer, if you're interested in drawing attention to that sentence, if you're interested in having the reader have a moment of pause to consider the sentiment of the sentence, to consider the meaning of the sentence, you might think about using antimetaboly to get them basically to slow down. And this is the kind of thing that a lot of technical writers and professional writers will talk about, right? It's really about the reading experience. As rhetoricians and as writers, we're designing experiences. They happen to be literate experiences, right? They happen to be experiences conveyed through the interpretation of little symbols. And so we're asking ourselves, what do we want the reader to be doing? Sensing, right? And when you want that reader to be kind of flowing and just reading through the sentences and not even noticing that they're sentences and just having a kind of crescendo or flow, right, you're not going to use antimetaboly. You're going to use nice parallel structured sentences that bounce along with a kind of cadence you want. Great. And then at times, right, you want that reader to stop. And not using a paragraph break or, a new heading or something, right, or a new chapter break. You want that reader to stop mid-paragraph and consider what you're conveying, right? And the antimetaboly is one of many ways to do that. And you'll have time in this class to experiment with these sorts of things in your own writing. See what sorts of effects you can create with this new awareness of these devices. Okay, the next two also go together, anaphora and epistrophe. And they're pretty easy. They're just a matter of repeating clauses. Okay, so anaphora is just the repeating of the opening of successive clauses. Now, these clauses can be short and within a sentence, or they can be longer and be sentences themselves. So what counts as a clause kind of scales from small to large. But what makes it anaphoric is if the openings of those clauses repeat. This is an example from a Native American man, Leonard Peltier, right? I am everyone who ever died without a voice, or a prayer, or a hope, or a chance. Everyone who ever suffered for being an Indian, for being a human, for being indigenous, for being free, for being other. Now, he could have written this without that repetition of or, for, right? He could have written this as I am everyone who ever died without a voice, prayer, hope, or chance. Everyone who ever suffered, period. I am everyone who ever suffered for being an Indian, a human, indigenous, free, or other. He could have done this, but he didn't. He did something else. He used anaphora, right? And so you have it multiple places in this sentence, in this complex sentence. You have a you have a repetition of everyone who, which separates the two major clauses in this sentence. And then you also have the or a, and for being, right? And so in that way, it's anaphoric because he's repeating the openings of clauses for a kind of added dramatic effect. You might call it emphasis. Oftentimes used as well for a sort of building or rising conflict or rising tension, leading to a kind of climax. Another example, a little less poetic, but used in political discourse. We have seen it in the courage of passengers. This was right after 9/11. We have seen it in the courage of passengers who rushed terrorists to save others on the ground. We have seen it in the endurance of rescuers working past exhaustion. We have seen the unfurling of flags, the lighting of candles. We have seen the decency of a loving and peaceful people. Now here's a good case where those clauses are quite large, right? The clauses are in fact independent sentences of their own. And by opening with we have seen it over and over, or at least we have seen. The it is not part of the fourfold successive clause structure, right? It's we have seen, we have seen, we have seen, we have seen. So the idea here is, that there's a kind of endurance or a kind of perseverance that's conveyed through this repetition, which, Bush's speechwriters were clever to do because it's representing the kind of perseverance and determination that the nation espoused post 9/11. And so here you have that kind of symbolism being presented through a stylistic device, not the discussion of a metaphor, not the discussion of an allegorical tale, simply through sentence level anaphora. Obvious anaphora in much of Martin Luther King's oral rhetoric. I think you all get the hang of it at this point, so I won't discuss this one. If you do have questions on what makes this anaphoric, please do ask. Epistrophe is the opposite. Well, not really the opposite, but the closing of successive clauses. Anaphora is about the openings. Epistrophe is about the closings. So you've got a few examples. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, right? So that's those successive clauses are what is being repeated is at the end of the clauses. Here's a good example from scientific writing. Until a few years ago, Guam had 6 species of bird unique to the island. Today, the bridled white-eye is extinct. The Guam broadbill is extinct. The rufous-fronted fantail is almost certainly extinct. And the other 3 species are not far behind. And so clearly this writer could have written this in a list where the term is extinct, or are extinct, is used simply once, right? The bridled white-eye, the Guam broadbill, and the rufous-fronted fantail are either extinct or almost certainly extinct. But this writer chose not to, used that emphasis, used that epistrophe, or that repetition at the end of successive clauses to kind of convey a gravity to this paragraph. Again, typical effects of epistrophe are the same as anaphora, though you might find all sorts of other effects of these devices in your own writing. The last 2 stylistic devices go together as well as a pair. Polysyndeton is simply when you add conjunctions between items in a series. Usually we use commas, right? And in this case, if you don't use commas, but use the term like usually and, not always, but usually and, then you're using polysyndeton. So the forces that tend for evil are great and terrible, but the forces of truth and love and courage and honesty and generosity and sympathy are also stronger than ever before. So he's clearly, instead of a more standard edited English approach to this sentence would be to use commas for all of those ands except the last one. Teddy Roosevelt doesn't, right, for a certain kind of effect on the reader, and I'm sure you can hear that effect. There's a sort of litany effect here, right, a kind of cascading of virtues that is being signaled by that repetition of and through polysyndeton. Yeah, this is a good way of putting it. I forgot the kind of language I used for the effect, and I think vehemence works well here, especially with Teddy Roosevelt's case. Oftentimes rhythm. I will mention that oftentimes polysyndeton offers equal force to each element in the string. In other words, that truth, love, courage, honesty, generosity, and sympathy with polysyndeton typically have, in this case true, typically have the same kind of weight in the sentence. And you won't find that to be the case in the next term, asyndeton. In asyndeton, typically the effect is that the emphasis is on the final term. So if you want to equally honor each term in your series in a way that creates emphasis, use polysyndeton. And we'll now move on to, in a minute, asyndeton. Lots of cases of polysyndeton, any of these devices actually, in lyrics, but you've got a great one from Dylan, and I think, and I'll tell it and think it and speak it and breathe it and reflect it from the mountains so all souls can see it. So you've got polysyndeton going on with the ands indicated in blue. Now, asyndeton, and that's just omitting those conjunctions between items in a series. So you're not using, say, a terminal and or a terminal or the way we usually would. You're using just all commas or all punctuation, like this case. Back to our case that we used for parallelism and chiasmus. In truth, it was a failed marriage, a wrecked home. Notice that the and is missing before a world destroyed. So a failed marriage, a wrecked home, a world destroyed. And so that makes this case asyndeton, okay, because the and is missing. Excuse me one moment. Okay. Typical effects, same as polysyndeton. There's vehemence. Notice here, though, that the emphasis is on the final word, as opposed to equal emphasis on all of the words, which was typically the case with polysyndeton. And that word piling, that's a case where you're sort of just, asyndeton is used sometimes for word piling, which is a really good effect you should know as a writer. And that is when you kind of just want to create the effect of haphazardly sort of throwing on more descriptive terms, more terms, more of whatever you're conveying in a kind of haphazard way. Okay, and I think I have an example coming up of word piling. This is not an example of word piling. So here you have asyndeton working as well in this case we've already looked at, because the terminal or, the terminal conjunction is missing in that sentence, right? Okay. Yeah, here's your case of word piling. First century Jerusalem was a multilingual city with Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, all competing to be heard in a veritable Tower of Babel. So that and is missing from preceding Hebrew, right? That would be standard edited English would demand that there is an and prior to Hebrew. Why has this writer left it out? It's likely the case that they're trying to affect word piling, right? Which is a case of they just want to like continue to list items that are all conflated in a particular situation in a haphazard way, right? And it works in this case. And so you've got first century Jerusalem was a multilingual city. This writer, he or she is not going for order and serenity in this case, right? He's going Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, all competing to be heard in this veritable Tower of Babel. So that's asyndeton, but a more specific case of word piling. And you can do word piling with devices other than asyndeton, right? I mean, think for yourself for a while. Take some time and think about that effect when you want to create an effect of just this sort of unrelenting addition of items into a kind of chaotic milieu. You can do that in a lot of different ways, and this is just one of them. Because the and is missing, it's asyntotonic. Okay, that concludes the first set of stylistic devices I want to talk about. Last, what I will do is go through a few examples with you. This is just eight cases in an exercise, just to give you an idea of where you should be, what you should be able to see at this point. I hope this sort of prepares you for what you're likely to see on quizzes or classroom exercises that we do. Okay, so maybe take a break, hit pause, and when you're ready to work through these with me, resume this video and I'll work through them. Okay, let's get started. So the directions, there's only one in task for all of these, all 8 of these cases, and it's just to correct faulty parallelism. So we're going to assume, remember before I said, sometimes people use faulty parallelism poetically, strategically, namely chiasmus, right? That world destroyed was an example of faulty parallelism, but used to great effect. So, but we're just going to assume in these 8 cases that that's not the case, that these writers are not trying to use faulty parallelism in some clever, strategic way. We're assuming these writers simply aren't really kind of executing correct parallelism in their writing. I mean, maybe they don't know about it, right? So let's work through these. Leonardo suggested conducting underwater attacks and to flood the land that the Turkish army had to cross. Okay, parallelism has to do with coordinate elements being in similar grammatical form. What are the coordinate elements? Well, there are 2 things going on here. Leonardo suggested 2 things. He suggested conducting something and to flood something. Are conducting and to flood in the same grammatical form? No. You'd need to do something like this. Leonardo suggested conducting underwater attacks and flooding the land that the Turkish army had to cross. That works. Or you could leave the to flood like that and then change the first one. They're again both grammatically similar now. Leonardo suggested to conduct underwater attacks and to flood. I mean, that works grammatically. I think it doesn't have the same. It's awkward writing. I think this is a far better rewrite would be this case. Though either case would be right on a quiz. Leonardo suggested conducting underwater attacks and flooding the land that the Turkish army had to cross. Yes, now you have conducting and flooding in the same grammatical form. I like to spend my winter holidays skating, skiing, and something else. Okay, so the coordinate elements here are skating, skiing, and I enjoy snowboarding as well. Well, hopefully you can hear in that case that that third piece is just not in the same grammatical form as the other 2. And therefore you're going to have real parsing problems. The reader's going to have some parsing problems with in the reading experience. Easiest way to fix that would be this. I like to spend my winter holiday 3 things: skating, skiing, and snowboarding. They're all 3 in the same grammatical form, and you're done. A Manhattan-era physicist, Toller, what did Toller do? Toller did a couple of things. He criticized this phrase. He cited France as a noteworthy model for energy investment, and Italy as well. This is the problem, right? There's nothing parallel here. There's something missing. You've got Toller criticizing, Toller citing, and Toller doing what? That's what's missing. So you can handle this several ways. This writer is really just trying to link France and Italy in this setting. So I would solve it this way. A Manhattan-era physicist, Toller criticized the lack of U.S. investment in non-proliferation and cited France and Italy as noteworthy models for energy investment. Now you have a parallel sentence: criticized and cited. The virus is usually contracted by coming into contact. Okay, so again, you can just tell right off the bat these sentences. So the virus is usually contracted by, now you're going to have a series of coordinate elements. Coming into contact with an infected person, consuming, or, now, this is a subtle one, but you've got, because this element didn't start with by, that means that this by makes this a case of faulty parallelism. The virus is usually constructed by, you can kind of think of it as a colon here, coming into contact with an infected person, consuming food and drinks contaminated with the virus, or, this by needs to go, touching a contaminated surface, and then touching your mouth. Now it's parallel. Okay, that makes it parallel. You have the same grammatical form in all of the coordinate elements. Another way to solve this, the virus is usually contracted by coming into contact with an infected person, by consuming food or drinks contaminated with a virus, or by touching a contaminated surface and then touching your mouth. That would work too. I don't see necessarily why you'd want to repeat that by, but if you did this again on a quiz, it wouldn't be wrong. One of the earliest pioneers of computation and art, futurist Ray Kurzweil, adopted a recursive approach rather than iterating. So stop for a second and think, why is this faulty parallelism? It's a more difficult case, but I hope you can see that the two coordinate elements, anytime you're talking parallelism, you're looking for a series of items that the reader is going to compare grammatically in order to understand the sentence. And so what are these items in this case? Well, the comparison is between recursive and iterating, and those are not of similar grammatical form. And so you'd need to change one to meet the other, or change both of them to a third grammatical form in which they're the same. Okay, so adopted a recursive approach rather than an iterative approach. I could say one instead of approach again. Okay, so Kurzweil adopted two things. A recursive approach, no, sorry, not two things, rather than the second thing. A recursive approach rather than an iterative approach. Recursive is an adjective, iterative is an adjective, and so these two coordinate elements are of the same grammatical form. Adopted a... You could also do something like this. They're still grammatically the same, right? Adopted recursion rather than iteration. It's a little clunky. It's a little too concise for the voice that was begun in this opening a positive and then the base clause, but it works. Like one of the earliest pioneers of computation and art, there's a bit of flow there, right? Futurist Ray Kurzweil adopted, and now it gets clunky, recursion rather than iteration. But it works in terms of the assignment, which is, just to fix the faulty parallelism. Personally, I think the best one, given the voice, is probably this one. Recursive approach rather than an iterative one. Yeah, recursive and iterative both functioning as adjectives. She is not only an accomplished jazz dancer, but also knows her way around the rugby pitch. Okay, so this case you have, she is not only, now you're looking for noun clauses, because the first one is a noun clause, right? An accomplished jazz dancer. Notice it didn't say she dances well. If it did, dances is a different verb form, or a grammatical form. But she didn't say that, or the writer didn't say that. She is not only noun form, noun clause, but also, well, now you need another noun clause. So what you could do here is she is not only an accomplished jazz dancer, but also a veteran rugby player. Okay. So here she is not only an accomplished jazz dancer, but also a veteran rugby player. Yeah, so here you have parallel coordinate elements. There would be, of course, a million other ways to revise this, but this is the easiest. Here's a great case from high-stakes technical writing. The Condor power plant offers the TMS-80 training for two reasons. So they're telling you right off the bat, we're going to give you two coordinate elements here. The first, to improve something. Notice this form of infinitive verb form. And secondly, well, not an infinitive verb form, right? Now you have for the protection of. So you've got to improve is element number one, for the protection of element number two. Well, what do you need to revise this to have them be of similar grammatical form? You would need to protect. Now you've got it. To improve and to protect. I guess the other option would be the Condor power plant offers the TMS-80 training for two reasons. I guess you could do this. Oops. for the improvement of employee performance and for the protection of nearby residents in the event of a core fault. That's that's parallel. It doesn't sound great. This is a far better, either one would satisfy a quiz. This is, oops, to improve employee performance and to protect. I think that's your best guess. Best option, to protect nearby residents in the event of a core fault. Yeah. Now, you might ask yourself, who cares, right? Who cares about these little details? Lots, of course, if you're interested in language, you probably already care. You care because you want the language, you want to write effective, sometimes beautiful, sometimes strategic writing. But if you're not that interested in language, if you're taking this course or thinking about style for other reasons, and you're kind of wondering why there's this attention to such detail, at the very least, I hope you can consider the fact that, especially in cases like this with high stakes writing, clarity is of the utmost importance. I mean, we're talking about nuclear power plants in this case. We're talking about people reading quickly. We're talking about audiences for whom English might not be a first or a second language. And we're also talking about translation issues. Texts if you go to work at an organization and have a writing function at that organization, one of your first considerations, I hope, in this world will be, what languages are these texts I'm writing translated into, right? When I worked at IBM in California, our texts were translated into dozens of different languages and sent globally, okay? And so anytime, in this case, clearly, parallel structure leads to more effective translation, and you're more likely to have improved communication through translation if you write in this fashion. There's a second reason, and you might not care about this, but your boss likely will, or your boss's boss, and that is translation costs, right? And so if you're writing in clear, parallel structured, well-formed sentences, translation is not only more effective, but more efficient. The translation work itself is more efficient and reduces the cost to the company. So this is a clear case to me where writing actually pays off in terms of safety and in terms of efficiencies that the company you're working for probably cares for, in addition to all of the more artistic and personal principles that might motivate you to care about this sort of writing. Okay, last one. Legalizing marijuana would have positive effects on the economy. It would bring in more tax dollars for the local government, result in less money spent at jails and prisons. And, okay, so here's the problem, right? So it's going to do a bunch of things. It's going to verb, no verb. So it would bring in more tax dollars for a local government, result in less money spent at jails and prisons, and something like that. Create more employment options. Now you have your three coordinate elements: bring, result, and recreate. And they're all of the same grammatical form, namely verbs. Okay, that concludes video lecture 1. I look forward to meeting all of you, working through an exercise in class on Thursday. Please do bring any questions you have about this material to class. If you have a question about it, I think it's very likely others have the same question about it. Thanks, everybody.